Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So we have a great episode of Project Poirot today, not because of me, but because of how great the book is, and that is Crooked House by Agatha Christie. Now, this is not an Hercule Poirot novel, which is somewhat out of keeping for the title, Project Poirot, but I've thrown in, I think, 3 in total detours. We've already had one, which was And Then There Were None, which was not an Hercule Poirot novel, and then this week we have Crooked House by Agatha Christie, which again is not an Hercule Poirot novel, and then we will also detour into a Caribbean mystery in a while. But the reason I wanted to do that was because I think this book is sort of the culmination of some themes that we've talked about so far in Project Poirot that I wanted to discuss, and because, just to be honest, this is like a top 5 Agatha Christie book for me. I really love this one, and it's my project, and I wanted to talk about it, so we're talking about it. So let's get into this. A disclaimer for those of you who are not normal Project Poirot watchers, I do not do spoilers in these reviews. I will take you in the synopsis roundabouts to where we find a body, and I will not spoil any of the plot details after that, and I will also get into some character details, which, if you consider that to be a spoiler, you are warned now. I don't think it should be anything that would diminish your enjoyment of the novel as a whole. So with that being said, let's get into a quick little synopsis. So Crooked House was written probably in about 1948 or 1949. And it is taking place, however, right at the end of the war, so probably the fall of 1945-ish. And our 2 intrepid leads are Charles Hayward and Sophia Leonidas. Now, Sophie comes from this big family, the Leonidas family, and she has been separated from them during the war because she, like Charles, was off supporting the war efforts. They met during the war in the Foreign Office in Cairo, where she apparently had quite a bit of responsibility, even though she was in her early 20s, so quite young. Charles is about 10 years older than her, and they had sort of an understanding during that time. It's very, very Agatha Christie. She loves describing romantic relationships in this way anyway. But they didn't want to do anything until the war was over. So once they both survived the war, they're back in London, and Charles wants to get engaged. He wants to marry her, and she loves him. She wants to marry him, but she is somewhat hesitant, essentially because she feels like there's some unresolved stuff happening in her family, and she doesn't feel like she can really enter into marriage until that gets resolved. So Charles essentially gets swept up into the household, and he meets this extended family. Now, the entire Leonidas family is living together in a house called Three Gables, which the kind of patriarch, Aristide Leonidas, who is the grandfather, he built this house for his first wife, the mother of his children, who was, I think her name was Marcia de Havilland, something like that. And it's called Three Gables. It's described as sort of like a whimsical, gigantic English cottage. So he wanted to build her a cottage in the city, and it's like a mansion though. So it's a very, very large house. And at this point, all of the Leonidas family is living in the house just because of some of the circumstances of the war. So the first floor, what I would call the first floor, what they would call the ground floor, is Philip and Magda Leonidas. So that is Sophie's parents, and they have 3 kids, all of whom live with them. I guess Sophie does now. And that is, Sophie's the oldest, and then she has a younger brother, Eustace. Sounds right. He's 16-ish, and he has a paralysis. He's not well, so he's being educated at home. And then her little sister is Josephine, who is described as very ugly, and she's about 11 or 12. So they're on ground floor. Middle floor is where Aristide lives with his second wife, who is a woman named Brenda, and she is 50 years younger than him. She's way younger. So they live on the middle floor, and also all the servants live on the middle floor. And then on the top floor, Roger and Clemency Leonidas live, and he's sort of oh, I should mention Philip, the one who lives on the ground floor, her parents. Philip is a historian basically, and her mom is a mediocre actress, but she's very beautiful and very dramatic. On the top floor, Roger and Clemency. Roger is sort of a failed businessman. He was supposed to sort of take over the family business and hasn't necessarily done a great job of that. And then Clemency is a scientist. So which is kind of badass, right? I like that. So that's all of them are living together. And oh God, I can't remember now. Sorry, I listened to this a couple weeks ago. I think that Aristide is still alive when Charles first goes to see him, but it may be that he already has died. Basically, Aristide is dead towards the beginning of this novel, and this is the murder that we're trying to figure out. He was actually in pretty good health, all things considered, except for the fact that he had to take insulin every day. And essentially it very quickly comes out that he must have been dead when, yeah, I think maybe that's why she didn't want to get married yet, was that he had just recently died. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up before I started filming, but whatever, I'll deal. He died, and it is discovered that his insulin bottles were tampered with, so they know it was murder, and essentially the family is in an uproar because if the right person did it, and in their mind the right person would be Brenda, his much younger wife who's not related to any of them, then it'll all be okay, but if she didn't do it, then one of them did. So that's sort of like the question of the novel, figuring out who killed Aristide and why, and there's some other like side characters to the family. So the aunt, the sister of the late wife, Edith de Havilland, lives with Philip and Magda and has helped raise those kids. There's also a nanny in that family unit on the ground floor. There is a tutor for Eustace because he was too ill to go away, so he has a tutor, and then I think that's most of the other side characters you need to know about. So anyway, this is really basically a character study. So we spend most of the novel kind of like exploring, like there's some detection, but a lot of it is us just sort of exploring what these people are like and who might have done it. So all that to be said, let's get into some specific analysis. So I adore this book. Like I said, this is a top 5 Christie for me. I probably like this even better than And Then There Were None. So I probably could say this is my favorite like standalone Christie. I think it's known. So when I was doing research, apparently this was also one that she particularly liked. And I think you can really tell that she had a lot of energy for this book. It was apparently one that she had thought about for a long time before she actually wrote it. And it's also noted sort of in the Christie canon because it does have one of her best endings, depending on how you feel about it, but I love this ending, and I remember the first time I read it being like, kind of wondering if that's the direction she was gonna go, and then being like, no, and then when it happened, being like, yes, bitch, you're an ice cold bitch, and I love it. So anyway, so it's one that I really, really like. But in terms of the themes that we've been talking about and kind of why I wanted to call it out, I think that this is the culmination of her exploration of science and heredity in particular. I think she'll have other things where she does do some very interesting like psychological type work, but in terms of talking directly about heredity and this idea of blood tells, I think that this is sort of the zenith of that. And essentially what this book is about is Aristide Leonidas was like a very forceful personality. Like he was an immigrant who came to the UK, I think in like the 1880s, and built his fortune. He was like just very charismatic and like had a huge personality. And he was also very generous, by the way. So like he lavished money on all of his family. So that's part of what the kind of question here is that it's not like he was a miserly old rich guy everybody wanted to die. He was very well loved, and he was very, very generous with his family. So there was in theory no reason for any of them to kill him. So he has this specific personality, and there's this idea that each of his kids and each of his grandkids have kind of inherited different pieces of him, and that each of them sort of reflects him in a specific way. And the kind of question of the book is which of them has inherited a specific character traits between him and his wife, and I guess potentially some of the spouses of his children, that would create a killer. That's kind of what the question is, because there's this discussion about how the Leonidas side of the family has this sort of innate unscrupulousness that is tempered by kindness, and the de Havilland side has a kind of ruthlessness that's tempered by, I think, generosity or something, I forget. And they kind of question that comes up is, well, what would happen if somebody inherited both the ruthlessness, the unscrupulousness, but did not inherit the kindness? Like, what would happen? And so that's sort of a lot of what the book is exploring, is like, how do these different personalities interact? How are these different hereditary dispositions inherited, or how are they manifested in the person's personality? And to me, it's just such an interesting kind of window into early 20th century ideas about science and heredity, and the degree to which moral traits can be inherited versus Christie is very insistent, especially the later we get into her career, that education and environment do not shape people, it's their genes. And it's such to me, that's just a fascinating thing for her to kind of think. And you can tell, like, you can kind of see strands of this in some of her discussions about how people like can sometimes get educated above their station, because I think really what is implicit in that kind of assessment is that she thinks people are educated above their gene pool. And again, in the light of the horrifying context of eugenics of the Holocaust, so like that, but also in more like harmless versions of eugenics like Margaret Sanger. Eugenics in general in the early part of the 20th century have a very interesting kind of place in sort of like people's ideas about heredity, about what kinds of things can and can't be inherited, and coupled with sort of the rising interest in psychology, I just think it's a fascinating window into one of the most popular authors' kind of understandings, pretty limited understanding, I would argue, of how all of those different factors work. And right, we've seen kind of, I mentioned this at the time when we were reading Hercule Poirot's Christmas. I think that's sort of a dry run of this same kind of plot, where it's a very close character study, and what you're trying to figure out is who's inherited which different traits. And it's a theme that does come up quite a bit in Christie. I think the earliest reference I remember was in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, discussing the adopted son of Roger Ackroyd, and how his real father's blood, his like weak blood, told in him. This idea of blood tells. It's a theme that comes up a lot. So that was really the reason I wanted to sort of like pause on Crooked House and sort of take note of it, because I think this is the most sophisticated version of that we see, and it's kind of the most mature or like fullest discussion of this in a fictional work by Agatha Christie. So for that reason, like thematically, I find that very intriguing in this book, even if I think that some of the conclusions are sort of poppycock. I do think it's an interesting theme and one worth thinking about. And then, we have a lot of other kind of Christie-esque themes and discussions in this book for sure. There's a lot of misdirection. There's an accumulation of bodies. I think we see some interesting comments on parenting in this book. And I should say, it's interesting how deep the characterization is for most of the people in this book, with the exception of in theory, our two main leads. So Charles and Sophie are by far the least developed characters in this book. And it's interesting because they are sort of our protagonists, so you'd think we'd get a little bit more. I would say that Charles reminds me quite a bit of Hastings, and I think, again, maybe that's part of why I like this novel, because I do tend to like novels that Hastings narrates. So he reminds me of a less dumb version of Hastings, basically. And then Sophie is sort of said, the most I think we get really is that I think Sophie is sort of seen as the best of the gene pool. So she, I think in a lot of ways is sort of talked about as being the most like her grandfather, but in a very positive way. So that she is so smart, she's generous, like she's a kind person. And if she had been a boy, who knows what would have happened. But anyway, she is definitely seen as sort of like the ripest fruit from the Leonidas family tree, even more so than her father, who is, Aristide's son. And I think she sort of has taken the best of the Leonidas side, and then she has like sort of the beauty of her mom, and like, she hasn't taken too much of her mom's crazy, like, dramatic antics or whatever. So that's the most characterization we get for our two protagonists, which is kind of somewhat disappointing, I guess, because I wanted to know more about them, especially in this read. I was like, oh, I wish I knew more, because it's in theory sort of a love story for them as well. Like, the point is that they want to get this resolved so that they can get married, and I wish I just knew a little bit more about them so that I was rooting more for that relationship. But aside from that, everybody else I think has really interesting characterization. Some of the most notable notable ones to me are Clemency, the wife of the son who lives on the top floor. I really liked her. Josephine is a fascinating. She's like 11 or 12. So I think for a child, like, she is characterized in a very profound and interesting ways. And then I also really liked Edith de Havilland. I enjoyed the time that we got with her. So the characterization in this book is just fantastic. The only other thing I wanted to bring up is that, considering that this is the one written right after Taken at the Flood, there's so much less discussion of sort of post-war conditions. There's definitely allusions to it. Like, I think at one point we hear... at one point we hear about somebody buying clothing coupons illegally, like that kind of a thing. But in general, like, this is not a a closely observed portrait of post-war life. That was much more in Taken at the Flood. And then actually in the comments of that video, people were rightly reminding me that A Murder is Announced is also it's a much better book than Taken at the Flood, but has as much sort of commentary about the post-war conditions. So Crooked House is right in between those two books, but it doesn't really focus on that topic the way that those two books do. So just food for thought. So anyway, all this to say, I absolutely love Crooked House. I'm not going to put a ranking because it's not in the Poirot list, but this is one that I really enjoy. I think this is one that works extremely well as audio. So if you have the opportunity to listen to the audio, it's a very good production, and I think it lends itself well to that medium, so I definitely recommend that. Oh, and I also wanted to mention that at least at the time of this recording, the ebook for this book is on sale for $1.99. I tweeted about it, but just in case this has sold you and you were interested in ebook form at the time of this, in the US it is $1.99. So I highly recommend this one. It's, like I said, one of my favorites, and yeah, I think it's a very memorable Christie. So even if you don't end up loving this book, I think it's one that you would find worth your while, just because it is somewhat different and very memorable. So that being said, I think that will do it for this edition of Project Poirot. This is also my very last video in March Mystery Madness, so if you have been along from that, I'm glad to have you. I am continuing on in Project Poirot, so there will still be a lot of mystery videos on this channel, so if that is something that you are interested in, you know, feel free to stick around. I'd love to have you. But other than that, I think that will do it. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a really great day, and I will just talk to you soon.